Welcome to the February 25th, 2025 episode of The Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and I'm joined by Energy Show producer MC Breadner. So that MC says hi. Well, look, today is the show headline for today is Canada's pipeline fever dream explained. And MC, how many, are you sick of talking about pipelines? Because I'm sick of talking about pipelines.
Yeah, I am. I'd love to talk about something else.
You know why we can't? Is because Donald Trump has threatened this 10% tariff on Canadian oil and gas exports, and it's a big deal in Canada because we are the U.S.'s biggest provider supplier of oil and gas. And the first thing that everybody the only thing we're talking about is pipelines, more pipelines. Build us another pipeline to the West Coast. Build us another pipeline to the East Coast. Pipelines. And everybody's promising pipelines. The oil industry wants them. Pierre Poilievre, the federal conservative leader, says pipelines everywhere. It's like spaghetti. We're just going to throw it up in the air and have pipelines. Mark Carney, who is the leading candidate to be the next prime minister next month, is talking about building energy infrastructure to diversify markets. Pipelines don't come out of his mouth, but you don't diversify electricity markets, do you?
Mm.
No, you're not going to ship those over to Europe. The only thing that gets shipped and where we need new markets is for oil and gas and
Hmm.
primarily oil. And never mind the premiers. I mean, my God, Danielle Smith, and we have a tweet of hers today to just illustrate the point. But then even the BC premier, BC fought against Trans Mountain expansion for a long time.
Hmm.
But Trans Mountain expansion started out, by the way, for those who don't know, and particularly non-Canadian viewers, the Trans Mountain expansion got approved in 2019, and it was a Kinder Morgan project. And Kinder Morgan just bailed on it. They said, "Look, they would have been opposed for years, and it was going through the courts and dragging on, and they had their own problems with debt and so on." So the Canadian government bought the whole project, not just the pipeline that was being built, but the Trans Mountain pipeline system that had been built 50, 60 years ago. And the cost to complete Trans Mountain expansion, the new 525,000 barrel a day pipeline, was $5.7 billion. MC, tell the people at home, what did that project finally come in at?
I think it was like three or four times that.
34 billion. 34
A
billion.
lot.
Like six, seven times, well, six times,
Yeah.
we'll say, six times the amount. It's ridiculous. Now there are very good reasons why. It was in the middle of COVID. There were some very BC, we had where I live, had some very severe weather. What do we call them?
Like
Atmospheric
washouts.
atmospheric
Oh,
rivers, right? Where you have an enormous amount of rain, and BC is very mountainous, and the pipeline bed got washed away, and so they had to go back in and do it again, that kind of thing. So it's not just like government incompetence. There was, some legitimate reasons why the cost of that pipeline ballooned. But I'll tell you what, years ago, I interviewed a VP of a pipeline company, Canadian pipeline company, and he said, every time you do a pipeline, there's the budget you start with, and the budget you end with, your completion costs will be 2 to 3 times higher. He said that's the nature of doing big infrastructure projects. There's no way around it. It's always been that way. Nobody comes in on budget. So that's part of it as well. And that raises the question of why everybody and his dog wants to build pipelines and nobody is questioning that decision. I mean, aside from our friends in the climate movement, we don't talk about climate here. Our energy transition work is all about technology change in markets and economics. But we understand that the climate's an issue. Nobody denies the science and so on. Aside from our friends in that movement, who else have you noticed anybody that has raised the alarm about this stampede, the lemmings stampeding over the cliff?
absolutely not. Nobody's even talking about it, really.
Yeah, exactly. Here we are, and we need to bring up a point. Our longtime energy economist that I've interviewed for like almost 10 years, Kevin Byrne now is a vice president with S&P Global, so a big global consulting firm in the energy sector. And during the interview, he said, look, any pipelines that get built, any infrastructure like this, Canada now has the reputation of being such a difficult place to do these projects in that the governments will have to step in to de-risk it. That means they're going to have to invest or spend public taxpayer dollars to get that project off the ground. So, if you're a Canadian taxpayer, your money, my money, is going to be at risk here. And I would really like my elected representatives to, put down the pom-poms and take up a calculator and do the math on this. But
Yeah.
nobody is doing it. And this is an abdication of leadership. I'm really annoyed by this because I don't mind if we have a debate and both sides bring their calculators and everybody does the math and then we have a conversation about it and we go, oh, maybe not, or maybe we say, you know what, that is a good project. And that is in the best interests of Canada. And maybe we should build a pipeline to, the East Coast, the West Coast, the North Coast, who knows, one of our coasts. We got lots of them. Trust me. Anyway, so if we did that, I'd be okay with that because then I would know that my elected representatives are actually looking after my best interests and
Hmm.
the taxes that I pay. But nobody's doing that. Not Carney, not Poliev, not Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP, none of the premiers. And speaking of premiers, let's get right into the first PowerPoint slide. What this slide shows is two tweets. The first one this morning by U.S. President Donald Trump. And he says, our country's doing really well. And today I was thinking that the company building the Keystone XL pipeline that was jettisoned by Biden, yada, 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 we're going to put it back on the table. Easy approvals, almost immediate start. Did nobody tell him that the easements along the Keystone XL line, which was to go from Alberta down to the U.S. Gulf Coast, the easements have reverted back to the landowners. The pipe has either been sold or is too rusty to use. I mean, immediate restart? I don't think so. That is not going to happen. Here's what I think happened. Because Danielle Smith, the Alberta Premier, and Donald Trump share this particular affliction, and that is whoever talked to them last. That's who they go with. So I imagine this scene where the president goes into the Oval Office bathroom and he's standing at the urinal and somebody comes in and talks to him and says, "Hey, Donald, what about that Keystone XL pipeline?" Bam, he's out back at his desk, and well, I'm sure he washed his hands before he went back to his desk. But anyway, he's back at his desk. He gets his phone out, and right away he's tweeting about what a great thing Keystone XL is. Doesn't know a damn thing about it. Hasn't kept up with it. But somebody mentioned it, and now he's got a bee in his bonnet about the Keystone XL pipeline. Okay, we all know that's how Donald Trump operates. He's been like that for a decade. Since he first ran in 2015. Now, here's Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, responding. And she says, we agree. That project should never have been canceled. Lower fuel costs, yada, yada, yada. Let's all scrap, and she absolutely now she's in on Keystone XL. What she doesn't mention is that her predecessor knew that there was a very good chance that Biden was going to cancel it heading into the November 2020 election and invested $1.5 billion in the company that was building Keystone XL. That money was lost. That's taxpayers' money out the window. Then once Jason Kenney, the UCP leader, and then who became premier in May of 2019, then he unwound a deal that his predecessor, NDP Premier Rachel Notley, had done they had entered into a contract for oil by rail. It was a very significant contract. It cost the Alberta government $2 billion to get out of that contract. So right there between the pipeline and the oil by rail contract, $3.5 billion peed out the window, gone. So we've got the example of TMX. We've got the example in Alberta. I don't know. Would we trust anybody to any government to, support pipelines and put public money in a responsible way. And there's a very good reason why Canadians should be very skeptical about this, and that's just one of them. So anyway, Donald Trump and Danielle Smith put pipelines back into the news cycle again today, and that's one of the reasons we're talking about it. Okay, next slide, please. Now we're going to try to explain this to you. And we have a particular way because most of our work is the energy transition reporting and journalism. And so what we do, we have an analytical framework that we use trying to understand this. Because remember, the global energy system is huge. It's enormous. And it's changing very rapidly. And moving parts. I'm sorry, I haven't got enough fingers and toes to count them all. I mean, it's crazy complex. So we have an analytical framework that we use to explain. We'll get to that in a minute. But here's the thing that came across my desk in my inbox today. This is a Reuters story, and it says big oil backtracks on renewables push as climate agenda falters, and it's about BP, the British super major. And BP was one of the early European oil companies. Equinor, the former Statoil, the Norwegian company, was one. Shell toyed with this of pivoting from oil and gas and over time pivoting into energy transition kinds of investments. So wind and solar would be a good one, a good example. Hydrogen, EV charging networks. There was even talk about oil companies becoming like public electric utilities at one point. And all of them, except maybe Equinor, have backed right off that backed right off. They're getting out of it. And BP was one of the last, and its share price has underperformed all of the other super majors. And so its investors are on the warpath. And in order to keep the investors happy, BP is now, they're going to announce a strategy tomorrow, but there's been enough leaks. We pretty much know what's coming. And that is they're going to get rid of all of their wind and solar. They're going to get rid of anything that smacks of the energy transition. And they're going to go back to their knitting, back to basics, which is oil and gas extraction and refining. And in BP's case, it's also got some retail delivery. So it's going back to the basics. Okay, next slide, please. I told you we had an analytical framework. Here it is. We call this our energy transition theory of change. And there's two curves here that you need to know. So the first one is an S curve. This is very common. It's been around for decades and how to explain how new technologies are introduced into the marketplace. And you see in the far left, now we're using clean energy technologies as an example. So we're talking wind, solar, batteries, EVs, and heat pumps and electrolyzers. So in this particular case, they start out on the left side of the curve, and they take decades to get to the point where they're competitive in the marketplace because they have to scale up, the costs have to come down, there has to be supply chains built. I mean, it takes a long time. Now, some longer than others because you'll see here solar panels kind of got introduced first into the market in the late 70s, and then wind turbines in the 80s. The lithium ion battery was 1991. The first commercial EV was like the late 1990s. So all of these technologies have been in the marketplace, getting better and better. Costs have come down very dramatically. And then after that happens, you get to the inflection point. And the inflection point is when those technologies become economic and competitive with the old technology. So in this case, if you took electric vehicles, now an electric vehicle is competitive with a combustion engine car. And we can argue about, whether it was 2018 or 2020. I mean, these are details. But we use 2020, beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, as the inflection point for all of those five clean energy technologies. So now we've run this model past international scholars like Kingsmill Bond and others. Kingsmill, formerly of Rocky Mountain Institute, now at Ember, and they really like it. They say, "Look, this makes a lot of sense." And what we do is because the analysts like Kingsmill, when they use an S curve, once they're past the inflection point, then they're on the hockey stick part of the curve. till they get to be dominant in the marketplace. And then you see that little curve off to the right where they become mature and it's kind of flat after that point. They get 70, 80, 90% of the market. But that's where our curve starts. And it starts in 2020 and it tracks the disruption that's caused by those new technologies in markets and business models. So if you can see there, and this is a little, I apologize for the small writing, but so in 2020, we're going to use the example of oil, right? So in 2020, electric transportation passes its inflection point. And by that, we mean not just light duty cars and trucks, but we mean buses and we mean two and three wheelers, which are huge in Asia. And you can see that medium duty and heavy duty are coming. But by and large, electric transportation, the inflection point was 2020. Then it disrupts a couple of years, 2, 3 years later, it disrupts the global auto industry. And there's not even a debate about whether or not it's disrupted. We have some up on our YouTube channel. We have Michael Dunn, who's a former GM executive in Asia, who now consults with companies and governments. And I asked him the question. I said, Michael, point blank, is the auto industry disrupted? He said, absolutely. It's not even a question. Okay, so then we begin to see global automaker business models be disrupted. So what do we see? We see Volkswagen wanting to close factories in Germany and lay off, thousands of workers. We see Nissan, the Japanese automaker, that's basically on the verge of bankruptcy. It's got a year's worth of cash left. It had a deal with Honda that fell apart. The other German automakers are seeing their market in China evaporate. We're seeing Stellantis, the maker of the Jeep and the Dodge Ram trucks, in big trouble, had to replace their C. On and on and on. Not everybody is not all of the legacy automakers are on the brink of failure, but you can see they're very clearly disrupted and they're scrambling, trying to get into the electric transportation game. Some of them are doing well, some of them are not doing well. It's a disrupted industry, and we're seeing disrupted business models. What is upstream of the auto industry? It's the oil industry, because of course, oil provides the gasoline and the diesel that combustion engines burn. And you can see Our World in Data has a graph. We've used it before, but essentially 5 years ago, the percentage of combustion engine vehicles that were sold at the global level was like 96, 97%. Now it's 75%. That's what the forecast is for this year. So clearly, the number of combustion engine cars is coming down. China now makes about 32% of all the autos in the world, and they're driving the electrification of transportation. Over as much as 65% of all autos sold in China in 2025 will have a battery. That's how quickly this is changing. Last year was 50%. This year it's going to be 65%. So already Bloomberg NEF is saying, because of that rapid electrification of transportation, we expect road transport fuel demand at the global level to peak in 2026 or 2027 and then begin to decline. That's how disrupted this is. So what you see then, and that you'll see that early to mid 2020s, where the oil industry at the global level is starting to be disrupted. Its capital spending has reduced by almost 50% over the last decade. Its returns versus other sectors are much lower, and investors are very demanding that as much cash as possible can be returned to investors. We're starting to see, and this is something that doesn't get reported on. I came across a Bloomberg story, and it talked about how the super majors like the Exxon Mobils and Shells and BP were getting out of high cost, high emissions intense oil fields and crowding into fields like in Ghana, where the break even point was $30 a barrel. And the only obvious reason why they would do that is because they're worried that in sometime in the not too distant future, oil is not going to be worth $70 or $80 or $90 a barrel. It might be
Yeah.
worth $40 or $50 a barrel. And so you're beginning to see that reality, the energy transition erosion of the of demand for oil begin to be reflected in super major strategies because these are smart folks. They got their finger on the pulse. They can see what's coming. Then you get to the late 2020s, and our prediction is you're going to start seeing some oil companies in trouble. It might be national oil companies, not Saudi Aramco style, but there are plenty of other African countries or Latin American countries. Petrobras, you've lived in Brazil, Petrobras,
Hmm.
the nationally owned oil company there. They might be in there. They've had some trouble with debt and so on. So once things begin to contract, we're going to start to see individual companies uh, be disrupted, and some of them are going to be in financial trouble. Some of them might even fail. Then we get to 2030. That's when the International Energy Agency is forecasting peak oil demand. But we've said this many times on this show. It's not just the IEA. It's S&P Global, it's Bloomberg NEF, it's Rystad Energy out of Norway. I mean, on and on and on. I probably just off the top of my head, I could come up with half a dozen or eight. And I read a lot of that modeling because and not everybody agrees with the IEA, and I'll show you some of their scenarios here in just a moment. But let's assume for a moment that peak oil demand in 2030 at the global level is at least a major concern. I mean, this is something that we have to take seriously. Then, as we trace disruption through that chain, who's next behind after the peak oil demand? It's the Alberta companies. And in Alberta, 75 to 80% of the oil comes from the oil sands. And there are four big ones and a medium-sized one. So you got Cenovus, Suncor, CNRL, and Imperial Oil, four big ones. Mega Energy, which is kind of a medium one, and you've got some smaller players, smaller producers. And we think that in the 2030s, which would maybe be, 7, 8 years from now, you're going to start seeing big time disruption in those companies. And you're going to see some of them get into financial trouble. And you might even see, worst case scenario, you might see some of them fail. And when people say, well, that's not very likely, look at the disruptions we've had in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
2020 was the COVID pandemic, big disruption in the global economy. Then Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, big disruption to the global energy economy. Now we've got Trump 2.0 threatening to put tariffs on Canadian oil and gas, another disruption. Now, would anybody bet here if we've had three major disruptions in the last 5 years, irrespective of technology disruptions, that we're not going to have another one? Who knows
Yeah.
what? I would say that we should assume that disruption is going to be business as usual. That's what we should expect. We shouldn't expect the absence of disruption. So we think that by the early 2030s. Now, if we can get the next slide, please. When a business model is disrupted, and Clayton Christensen, was a professor at Harvard Business School, and he came up with this idea of the disruptive innovation. So, and Blockbuster is my favorite example. So, Blockbuster was, back in the 90s and the aughts. Blockbuster was the big kid on the block. You'd go to and rent your DVDs from Blockbuster. Netflix came along. And Blockbuster had a chance to buy Netflix, looked at the technology, the business model, and said, nah, we're going to pass things. A few years later, Blockbuster was bankrupt because, of course, Netflix had the innovative disruption with streaming video. And they
Yeah.
were able to make it work, and now they're dominate on the global market. So when there's a disruptive innovation, as electric transportation is increasingly for oil, there's three responses. One, pivot to a new business model. So we saw the Danish oil and natural gas company pivot became Ørsted and became a wind, the biggest offshore wind developer. can re-engineer your existing business model, and we've seen BP is an example of that. It tried to get into energy transition businesses. In Canada, Suncor was the biggest. I mean, it invested in wind and solar and a bunch of startups, Enercam and LanzaJet, and it's getting into hydrogen, all of those things. So it can do that. You can re-engineer your model and pivot slowly so that as the market for these new products grows, then you get out of the old and into the new over a period of decades. Or you can double down on the status quo. And what we've seen is that the energy transition businesses don't have the kind of returns that investors in oil and gas companies are demanding. And so they underperform, and then they have trouble maintaining their share price, and they're in trouble. So what do? They do exactly what Shell did. They do exactly what other company, like Suncor have done, and they get out of all of that stuff and they go back to their knitting. They double down on the status quo. Okay, next slide, please. This is from 2020. It's from the Corporate Knights magazine, and this was an op-ed penned by Laura Kilcrease, who's the CEO of Alberta Innovates, which is the Alberta government's provincial innovation agency, and Mark Little, who was the CEO of Suncor. And basically, look at that headline. The Canadian oil sands are best positioned to lead the energy transformation. I mean, that was the thinking 5 years ago. Is that the oil sands were making a ton of money, and that they would reinvest that money into energy transition businesses, products, and so on. They would decarbonize their very high emissions intensity oil, and eventually, like 2030, 2040, 2050, they would be a very different business than they are today. Now look at this headline. Just 3 years later, Suncor is turning its back on a clean energy future. Let's turn on. What happened was it turned out to be a bust, in part because of the economic problems caused by COVID. And they turfed Mark Little, and they brought in a new CEO and a veteran who just took them back to the past. And they concentrated on producing more oil and gas and increasing their margins and improving their financial performance. And essentially what BP is probably going to do tomorrow, and what other companies have been doing. So oil companies have basically retreated from any kind of energy transition investing and development, and they're going back to oil and gas. And Suncor in Canada was really at the front of that movement, and now it's back with its peers, and not doing that. Why would they do that? And this is a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, Ross Below, who was a former Imperial Oil engineer, and he's been retired about a decade, and he wrote a very influential piece in Maclean's where he said that the oil sands are toast. They're not coming back. They're on the decline. And I emailed him and I said, Ross, this is great. You made this argument. I think you're wrong. The data does not support your argument. Come on my show. We'll have a friendly discussion about this. I'll present the case for why the oil sands are in fact not in trouble. And this is one of the graphics that I would have used. And this comes from Rystad Energy, the Norwegian company. So on the left, you have basically all of the undeveloped oil reserves and what it costs to break even to get a barrel of oil out of the ground. And so you can see that the really cheap stuff, like in the Middle East, for example, ranges from $10 to just under $40 a barrel. And then there's some other categories, but all the way over to the far right, look at where the oil sands are. On the one hand, they look like they're they're the most expensive oil in the world to get, but of course, there's a range from $57 to $40 break-even costs. But still, you would think that some of these other oils would be developed long before the oil sands. Now, here's the counter argument, and this is data that I pulled out of a report. I think it was from S&P Global. This is more specific data that comes directly from the oil sands on average break-even costs, and look at that. And this is really important. The oil sands are not like other forms of oil production. The oil sands are like a manufacturing industry because, the resource is just like peanut butter. It's like trying to, so you build manufacturing, these processing plants, and you build infrastructure, and you build ways to either mine it, which they're not building any more of, or you use steam assisted gravity drainage to get it out of the ground. And then all of the majority of your capital gets paid upfront at the beginning of the project while you're building all of these assets. That's not the way it is elsewhere. It's like in the Permian Basin, you drill a well and you produce it for 2 or 3 years, and then it's basically very close to exhausted. And then you have to spend a bunch more capital to drill another well, and you just go on and on through that cycle. That's a short cycle investment. The oil sands, because their reservoirs last 20 to 50 years, are a long cycle investment. It takes you a lot longer to get your capital back. But once that capital is paid, then it becomes a half cycle. You go on half cycle costs. These are half cycle costs here. And it's basically to break even, to basically, it pays all of the costs on a daily basis, keep the lights on, pay the salaries, that kind of thing. Now look at the break evens. You've got some of it as low as $20. That's the mined synthetic crude. You've got SAG-D, probably around 30 or under $30 a barrel. The most expensive is the mined bitumen, and it's around $40 a barrel. All competitive at the prices we've seen for a long time, with the pandemic aside. So, contrary to what Ross and Below and others would argue, the oil sands are actually really competitive oil. Can't get it out to where the market needs to go, but nevertheless, this is it. This goes against the grain when people argue that the oil sands are high cost. Now, they have high emissions, which we've dealt with in another show, and they also have a tremendous amount of unfunded environmental liabilities. That would be, if they'd had to pay for it, would be a huge cost. That's grist for yet another show that we have planned in the future. What are these guys up to? Okay, now you need to understand this this graph, or graphic comes from OPEC's World Oil Outlook 2050, which is an update of World Oil Outlook 2045. And in OPEC's mind, their modeling shows that demand will go up from last year, I think it was 103 million barrels a day. And in 2050, 25 years down the road, it'll be 120 million barrels a day, 17 million barrels a day of growth in the next 25 years. So if you're an oil sands company, or you're the premier of the province in which they operate, and the province, remember, owns the resource, you're looking at that and saying, we can compete. We're the lowest cost producer. We want some of that growth, that 17 million barrels. And Danielle Smith has said over and over and over again, we want to double production from 4 million barrels a day to 8 million barrels a day. And now you can see why. Because in their worldview, which is shaped by OPEC's modeling, this is not a challenge. This is an opportunity. This
Right.
is why you want to build pipelines after pipeline after pipeline out to the East Coast and the West Coast and the North Coast and all over the place. Is because you think that we're not just entering the age of electricity. This will be the golden age of oil. If you're Danielle Smith, that's what you think. If you're an oil and gas CEO in Calgary, that's what you think. And this is the data. And the irony here is, I bet you none of them have actually read the report. I have. I spend time in it. But it's part of the narrative. I hear it all over the place that we're going to see growth out to 2050, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why. I talked about how there are other modeling or other conclusions that by other modelers that lead to them to conclude peak oil demand by 2030. Now, this is from the IEA, and they always have three scenarios: the steps, which is basically the status quo, the announced policy scenario, and the net zero. So the experts that I talk to say that the steps policy is very unlikely. Nobody even believes that we're going to see steps. And the net zero, I'm afraid just keeps getting less and less likely all the time. So that leaves us with the announced policy scenario. And look at what that modeling shows. In 2050, instead of 120 million barrels a day, we're going to be down to 57 million barrels a day, literally half of what OPEC thinks. Now, we can have a very fulsome discussion uh, discussing the modeling differences between the various companies. And that's perfectly legitimate. And you can, hell, I could make the argument for the OPEC modeling based on the fact that I've read it and I understand their assumptions. So we can have that discussion, but we shouldn't just pick one and ignore the other one. This is an issue of risk management, right? Like
Yeah.
when you're doing your budget and you say, okay, well, we're going to spend this and that, how risky is it, that I'm going to lose my job? How risky is it the taxes will go up? How risky that all of that? You do risk assessment in your own budgeting, right? Household budget.
Hmm. Yep.
As do I, as I'm sure do all the viewers. And this is an issue of risk management. How risky is it that it will be OPEC's view of the world in 2050 versus the IEA's view of the world in 2050? Because the IEA's view of the world is disastrous for Canada, for Canadian oil. And we never talk about this. We never talk about this. And this needs to be part of our conversation because if the public money is going into oil and gas infrastructure, then we need to, as taxpayers, be able to have an opinion, an informed opinion about whether or not our money is at risk. We've had
Absolutely.
enough. We've had enough with profligate politicians spending enormous amounts, tens of billions of dollars on pipelines that are inflated, pipelines that don't get built, on and on. We have to stop that. Okay. This is S&P Global's modeling for the oil sands. And there's a reason why I picked this, because unlike the OPEC, they kind of split the baby here. What S&P Global says is, and I've interviewed their VP of oil, Jim Burkhardt, a couple of times, and he says, yes, we agree with peak oil demand in 2030. We think that's going to come. But unlike the IEA, we think that the plateau, instead of declining, it'll plateau and it'll kind of go like this. There'll be undulations out maybe to 2040, 2045 before you see a beginning of a decline. That's their modeling. Great. But look what they've modeled for the oil sands in that scenario. Peaks at 2030 at 3.8 million barrels a day, up from about 3.2, 3.3 million barrels a day today. Then it begins to decline, and it declines to 3.5 million barrels a day by 2039. I don't see growth. I see a peak in a few years, and everybody agrees that there'll be another 500,000 or 600,000 barrels a day of supply added to the oil sands by 2030. I don't see growth. What I see here is modest decline over the next 15 years. That is not an argument for building one new pipeline, not even one new pipeline. And even our buddy Max Fawcett, the Canada's best columnist, works for the National Observer. Even he is willing to concede one pipeline. So when we say no more pipelines, this is what we're talking about. And there are other ways. There's 650,000 barrels a day of new capacity that could be added on down into the States. There's 300,000 barrels of new capacity that could be added onto the Trans Mountain expansion without building new pipelines. There are ways to do this, folks, without spending 30, 40 billion dollars on building new pipelines over the next 5 to 10 years. And at the very least, we should be having put this into the conversation. And when we're pulling out our calculators and running the numbers, doing the math, this should be one of the scenarios that we talk about. And maybe there's a smarter way to go about it. And in a future show, we're going to be talking about bitumen beyond combustion. So using it instead of making fuels, you make materials like carbon fiber, asphalt binder. That's one option. There's all kinds of options. Why, when we're faced with a crisis like this, instead of being innovative and creative, we just default to the status quo? And taxpayers now are supposed to pay for that. And if it turns out to be a horrible mess, it'll be great. 20, 15 years from now, I'll be able to say, well, I told you so. And won't that make me feel good while I'm paying a whole lot more taxes? Or I'm, this makes absolutely no sense. This is the last slide, and we want to end on this note because Peter Lougheed, he was the Alberta Premier from 1971 to 1986. And he, more than any other premier, was responsible for the start of the oil sands. He created a research organization called AOSTRA that developed steam-assisted gravity drainage, which accounts for 50% of production. He created the Crown Corporation, Alberta Energy Company. He required ethylene from natural gas to be retained, offered first to Alberta businesses that would turn it into petrochemicals. He is the father of Alberta's petrochemical cluster, which now is the second largest in all of North America. And the oil industry hated him. They banned him from the Calgary Petroleum Club. He was hated within the industry at that. Now he's an icon. Now everybody recognizes. Oh, and he also created the Heritage Fund, which the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund used as a model when they created their own fund. So that's how innovative Peter Lougheed is, and there's never been another one like him. None of his successors have even come close to having his vision for the future of energy or the political ability to put it into practice. Now, look at these are his 6 principles. And we give a hat tip now to Andrew Nikiforuk, who's a senior journalist, and he wrote about this in the Tyee back in 2012. 6 principles for Canadian oil and gas management. Behave like an owner because you are an owner. The Canadian Constitution gives the provinces full control over their resources. That means that the people of Alberta own the oil sands. Okay, so think like an owner, behave like an owner, collect your fair share. Don't be whittled down on royalties and taxes and all of that, with the threat that there's going to be a capital strike or somebody's going to pick up and leave because your taxes are too high. Yeah, you want to take your oil sands projects with you? See you later. Dismantle them and go. They're a captive company. Collect your fair share. Save for a rainy day. What else has Alberta done? Whatever Lougheed put into the Heritage Fund, they've almost spent it. Right? They've rated it so that they didn't have to either put in higher taxes or run deficits by the provincial government. It's now a shadow of what it should be. Save for a rainy day. Add value. Add value. I mean, that he was all about adding value. Why ship raw materials so somebody else in another country can add value to your product? Why don't you do it in Canada? Why don't you do it in Alberta? Go slow. And boy, if the modern pipeline debate isn't an example of what he was warning about, is don't go stampeding off on whatever the sexy thing is that's making the news cycles, and this time it's pipelines. Take some time, consider the alternatives, come up with a strategy, come up with a plan to implement the strategy. Listen to alternative voices. Where are the leaders with different plans? Not the NDP, not the Liberals, not the CPC, nobody. It's just it's the same old stuff that's being promoted by the usual suspects. And if I wasn't worried about being sued, I'd name them. But anyway, if you follow this issue, you know who I'm talking about. So go slow. And here's one that I have been arguing for a long time since Jason Kenney became premier, of Alberta in 2019, and then succeeded by Danielle Smith in 2022. Practice statecraft. Politics is hard because in Canada you have a weak central government and you have 10 strong provinces and then the 3 territories. So you don't get the federal government doesn't get to dictate on many files. And particularly on natural resources, it has shared jurisdiction on many things, like pipelines that cross borders. That's a federal responsibility. So the courts have said you need to cooperate. So there's been this principle for decades now, cooperative federalism. When the federal and provincial governments, their jurisdiction overlaps, the court says the courts, and the Supreme Court is what I'm talking about, you have to cooperate for the best, the public good. So how does Danielle Smith conduct herself? For the last 3 years, it's a litany every day. I get their press releases all the time, blaming Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, and the federal government for as the Bible says, every sparrow that falls from the sky gets blamed on Justin Trudeau. Just like Donald Trump, it's the same kind of populist politics, and that may get you elected, and it may even keep you elected. It doesn't get you what you need, because in Canada you need to build coalitions. You need to
Hmm.
go to your other premiers and you need to build support. And then you need to negotiate with the federal government. Everybody has to come to the table and work out deals. That's the way it's been done for decades and decades and decades. So this Alberta strategy of just constantly demonizing the federal government and the prime minister is really, it injures Alberta's economy, and particularly the ability to move forward with strategies to guard against what Trump is doing down in the US. Practice statecraft. Look at those three things. I saw Nikiforok's piece, and I read these things before, and I went, it was like a face palm. This is such common sense. He put it into practice for 15 years back in the 70s and 80s with great success. Where is the leader that would stand up today, practice those principles, turn them into a strategy, and solve the problems that Canada is confronted with today? There is not a one, not a one. And Canada and Alberta are going to suffer as a result of the poor political leadership that we are saddled with. And this is not a partisan criticism. All the parties are guilty. There's no leadership across any of them at the federal level or the provincial level. And even in the media and even in the industry and even amongst academics, there's none of this kind of leadership that we so desperately need.
Hmm.
Anyway, I have this, as you can tell, a bit of a hobby horse for me, because the solution to me seems self-evident, right? We have somebody who's done it before. They've set out the principles. We've seen the principles in action. We've seen the benefits of them. This ain't rocket science, folks. We know how to do this, and we choose not to. We choose to behave like lemmings. And this is not the time for lemmings. This is the time for leaders to stand up. And I will close, MC, with my favorite quote from Arnold Toynbee back in 40 years ago when I was doing a history major at the University of Saskatchewan. I had to read his 11 volumes of a study of history. And the big conclusion I came away with was Toynbee said, civilizations rise when leaders meet challenges, and they fall when leaders fail to meet existential challenges. This is an existential challenge for Canada. We need leaders to step up and be equal to the task. If they are not equal to the task, we are going to have severe consequences at the federal level and in Alberta in particular,
Yeah.
in its economy. That's our argument. I probably, what do you say? That
Yeah.
wasn't a very fair toss on my part, so I apologize.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think we have an excellent example from the past. And we need to look back at what we've done before. We know that Alberta, the workers of Alberta, the people of Alberta are strong. They have the capacity to do this. So, we did it back with Lougheed, and we can do it again. We just need somebody to step up to the plate.
Well, hopefully one of those leaders will watch this video and be inspired and say, hey, you know what? Maybe I'm on the wrong path and I need to pick another track here and do something a little different, and then they'll come forward. But at Energy Media here, we are going to continue to bang this drum. And I apologize if this gets tiresome for you, because it gets tiresome for us. Yeah, if people would listen and we could have this conversation, we wouldn't have to bang the drum. But that's not the case. So here we go. We're going to bang it. Thank you very much. We're going to be back tomorrow, and we're going to talk about Peter Lougheed. I've got Troy Wason, who's a friend of mine. I've known him for many years. Worked in the Progressive Conservative Party of Alberta when Lougheed was premier, and has written
Mhm.
extensively about him. He's a historian, and we're going to talk about what Lougheed did, how he was received, what his strategy was, you know that he wasn't a conservative?
No, I didn't know that.
There's a very famous comment. It's actually not that well known in Alberta, but it's famous. I think it's a great comment. He said, "We were never conservatives. We just wanted to get stuff done." And that's what we need is no more partisanship, no more culture wars, none of that stuff. It's there's a task at hand. We need to get it done. And Peter Lougheed is the guy. Lougheed 2.0. That is what we are advocating for. So we'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah. Okay, can't wait.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.